I want you to try and picture a scene and really try to build this image in your mind as vividly as you can.
Right. Set the stage for us.
Okay, so the year is 1961. You are standing on this really small, sun-drenched coastal strip on the western edge of the Indian subcontinent.
Sounds pretty idyllic, honestly.
It does. The breeze is rolling off the Arabian Sea. It's warm. You can smell the salt and the palm groves. If you just look at the landscape, it's perfectly serene.
But the reality is completely different.
Completely. The tension in the atmosphere is just heavy. It feels, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm breaks.
Yeah, because outside of this tiny little picturesque enclave, the rest of the massive Indian subcontinent has been independent for 14 years.
Exactly. They threw off the British Empire. They're busy building this colossal democratic new republic. But right here, on the soil you're standing on, a European flag is still flying.
It's honestly a staggering geopolitical anomaly.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the globe in 1961, and it's the era of mass decolonization.
Right. Empires are collapsing everywhere.
Exactly. New nations are popping up across Africa and Asia. But amidst this massive tectonic shift, this one tiny pocket of land it's completely disconnected from the reality around it.
And it's not just a symbolic flag, either. This is a place where the local police report directly to a ruthless dictator sitting thousands of miles away in Lisbon, Portugal.
Yeah, the level of control is wild.
It really is. Like, if you want to print a simple invitation to your daughter's wedding or, I don't know, a baptism card for your baby, you can't just take it to a printer.
No, you need the physical ink stamp of government censors.
Yeah.
For a wedding invite.
Right. And meanwhile, just over the border, beyond these lush green hills, a massive, modernized Indian military machine is quietly gathering, just waiting.
Which brings up the obvious question.
Exactly. How does a situation like this even happen? How did a small coastal land remain under European colonial rule for 463 years?
Long after the British, the French, the Dutch had all packed their bags.
Yeah, how was this one European power still holding on? And maybe the better question is, what exactly happened in those final super dramatic 36 hours when the dam finally broke?
Those questions are really the perfect engine for what we're going to explore today.
I'm so excited for this deep dive.
Same, because this story is arguably one of the most cinematic, emotionally charged, and genuinely surprising chapters in modern history.
We're talking about the liberation of Goa.
Yes. And our mission today is to just pull apart all the intricate layers of this narrative. We'll look at the military maneuvers, sure, but we really need to understand the deep cultural paradoxes, too.
And the fierce nationalism, right?
Absolutely. Plus a series of accidental geopolitical chess games that just defied all logic. We have an incredibly detailed source for all of this, by the way.
We do. As historian Valmiki Falero explains in his book Goa, 1961, the complete story of nationalism and integration, looking at this purely as a standard military timeline, completely misses the point.
Yeah, the history of Goa is just this sprawling epic of unintended consequences.
It really is.
Falero's research reveals a blueprint of an empire built entirely by accident. We're going to walk through massive economic blunders, a vibrant local culture that refused to be erased, and a tense international standoff.
A standoff that almost ended in the total destruction of Goa's ancient heritage, which is just crazy to think about.
Almost nothing in this story goes according to the grand plans of the people in charge.
Which is, honestly, the best kind of history. The messy, unpredictable kind.
Definitely.
So, to understand the standoff in 1961, we can't just start in the 20th century. We have to wind the historical clock way, way back.
Right. We have to figure out how the Portuguese ended up on this specific stretch of coast to begin with.
Let's go to the year 1498. Paint a picture of Portugal at this time, because I think a lot of people imagine this massive, wealthy European juggernaut.
Oh, not even close. In 1498, Portugal is a remarkably small nation. We're talking about a population of barely over 1 million people.
Wow, that's tiny.
Yeah, they're situated on the extreme western edge of Europe, staring out at the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
And they're essentially just crawling out of the Middle Ages.
But they have a massive problem.
A huge problem.
Yeah.
And that problem is driving an absolute desperation to find a sea route to Asia.
What's the specific pressure point there? Why this sudden urgency to brave the unknown ocean?
Well, it all traces back to 1453. The Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople.
Ah, right.
And when that happened, they essentially choked off the traditional lucrative overland trade routes that brought spices from the east into Europe.
And spices weren't just a luxury back then.
No, they were a necessity. You needed them for preserving food and masking the taste of spoiled meat in an era before refrigeration.
So whoever controlled the spices controlled immense wealth.
Exactly. With the land routes blocked by the Ottomans, Portugal realized their only option was to figure out a way around Africa.
Which is a terrifying journey at that time.
Completely. But it initiates decades of perilous maritime exploration. And it culminates in Vasco da Gama finally rounding the Cape of Good Hope and dropping anchor in India.
And he lands near Calicut on the Malabar coast in May of 1498.
Yes, he does.
Now, I have to jump in here because there is a detail in the history that feels so incredibly scripted you'd roll your eyes if you saw it in a movie.
The Calicut connection.
Yes. You have Vasco da Gama arriving in Calicut in 1498 to plant the seed of this massive Portuguese empire in India.
Right.
463 years later, the man who ultimately orchestrates the military eviction of the Portuguese from India is the fiery Indian defense minister, V.K. Krishna Menon.
And where is Krishna Menon from?
Calicut. It's his exact hometown.
It's just a stunning piece of historical symmetry. The empire begins and ends with a connection to the exact same coastal town.
It's the ultimate full circle moment. But while da Gama arrived in Calicut, Calicut didn't become the center of their empire.
No, to understand how Goa specifically became the crown jewel, we have to look at the year 1510.
Because the Portuguese didn't just sail up the coast, look at Goa, and decide to conquer it out of nowhere, right?
No, and this is the part that completely shatters the standard colonial narrative for me.
We're so used to the story of a European armada arriving, planting a flag by force, and subjugating the locals.
But that isn't what happened here at all. Alfonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese governor in India at the time, was actually invited to invade Goa.
Wait, really? An invitation?
He was. It was a formal solicitation. Albuquerque was initially based further south in Cochin. In 1510, he wasn't even thinking about Goa.
So what was he doing?
He was in the middle of refitting his fleet for a completely different military mission. His target was the Persian Gulf, specifically Ormuz, to secure Portuguese control over the Red Sea trade routes.
Okay, so he's preparing his ships, and then what happens?
He is intercepted by two crucial figures.
Who has the power and, frankly, the audacity to flag down a heavily armed Portuguese armada and pitch them a side quest?
Right, well, one of them is a naval captain named Tamaya. He was allied with the Vijayanagar Empire, which was a massive Hindu empire in South India.
Okay.
And he had established friendly, cooperative relations with the Portuguese. But the primary architect of this detour is a man named Mahal Pai.
Let's focus on Malpai. What is his position, and what is his motivation for bringing a foreign European military force into his backyard?
So Mahal Pai was an incredibly powerful local Hindu leader in Goa. His title was Sardasai, which essentially meant he was a chief headman who held the tax-collecting rights over a vast territory.
How vast are we talking?
Somewhere between 500 and 800 villages. He had immense wealth and influence.
Okay, so he's doing pretty well for himself?
He is, but Mahal Pai was operating in a climate of intense frustration and fear. At that time, Goa was under the rule of the Adil Shahis, the Muslim rulers of Bijapur.
And I'm guessing they didn't get along.
Not at all. The local Hindu population, which Mahal Pai represented, was facing severe persecution.
So they were being squeezed by the existing administration.
Squeeze is putting it mildly. The oppression was particularly fierce from a group called the Navayats, who were backed by the Turkish governor of Bijapur stationed in Goa.
What kind of oppression?
There was rampant confiscation of property, religious suppression, and really heavy taxation. Mahal Pai was looking at a dire situation for his people and his own power base.
That makes sense.
And interestingly, Falero's research notes there was even a widespread local prophecy circulating at the time, delivered by a mendicant, that a foreign people from a distant land would arrive and free Goa from Bijapuri rule.
Oh, wow. So Mahal Pai sees Albuquerque's fleet down in Cochin, and he thinks there's the fulfillment of the prophecy.
Exactly. And more importantly, there is a very large hammer I can use to smash the Bijapuri administration.
It's a classic proxy conflict strategy. Mahal Pai figures he is hiring a massive, heavily armed security firm to clear out a rival power structure.
That is the exact political calculus. Mahal Pai leverages his connection with Captain Tamaya to approach the Portuguese. The Tampacars, as the locals called them, the hat wearers.
The hat wearers, I love that.
Yeah, so Mahal Pai essentially hires Albuquerque.
Yeah.
The proposition is straightforward. Bring your cannons, bring your soldiers, sail up to Goa, and drive the Bijapuris out.
He likely assumed the Portuguese, whose primary obsession was spices and trade routes, had absolutely no interest in the tedious business of governing a massive agrarian landmass.
Right. Why would they?
He probably thought they would come in, do the heavy lifting, take a massive payout in gold or trade concessions, and sail away to the Persian Gulf.
Leaving Mahal Pai as the undisputed ruler of a liberated Goa, it was a very logical assumption based on Portuguese behavior up to that point.
Right. So does Albuquerque go for it?
He accepts the offer. It takes him 2 attempts, but on November 25, 1510, his forces successfully drive the Bijapurs out of Goa.
Okay, so Mahal Pai gets exactly what he asked for. The Muslim rulers are gone.
They are. But then comes the twist that alters the course of history for the next 5 centuries.
The security firm decides they really like the neighborhood.
Exactly. Albuquerque was a brilliant, forward-thinking naval strategist. Once he actually sets foot in Goa, he surveys the landscape and realizes he has stumbled upon a geopolitical gold mine.
What made Goa so special geographically?
Well, it was centrally located on the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. It possessed fantastic, deep, natural harbors that were perfectly protected from the monsoon winds.
It's the ultimate defensive and offensive staging ground.
Precisely. Albuquerque looks at Goa and realizes this shouldn't be a pit stop, this should be the headquarters.
Wow.
He bypasses his original base in Cochin, even though Cochin actually had vastly superior shipbuilding infrastructure and established trade networks at the time.
But he stays in Goa anyway.
He decides to stay because it offered the perfect geographic center for his grandest vision.
And what was that vision? Because this is a huge pivot from just looking for a trade route.
Albuquerque wanted to establish a mare nostrum, a Latin phrase meaning our sea.
Ah, so total dominance.
Yes. He didn't just want to participate in the spice trade, he wanted Portugal to entirely monopolize it.
And to do that,
he needed a network of impregnable naval fortresses controlling every major choke point in the Indian Ocean. And Goa was the perfect, unassailable hub to coordinate that massive maritime empire.
So Mahal Pai opens the door, and Albuquerque walks in, changes the locks, and declares it the capital of the Portuguese state of India.
That's exactly what happened.
That single opportunistic decision books what would ultimately become the longest-running colonial empire in human history.
It really is incredible when you look at the timeline.
To really grasp the scale of it, think about this. Portugal's global empire officially started with the capture of a port in North Africa in 1415.
Right.
And it did not completely officially end until they handed Macau back to China in 1999 and withdrew from Timor-Leste in 2002.
We are talking about nearly 600 years of imperial history.
And for 4.5 centuries of that, Goa was the beating heart of their Asian dominions.
It was.
But I want to dig into what that actually meant for the people living there. When the Portuguese decided to stay, what did their rule look like on the ground?
Well, the portrait painted in the research is not of a unified, harmonious society.
Wow, it describes a place that was deliberately fractured.
To understand life under Portuguese rule, you really have to understand the concept of the two Goas. It is an absolute foundational element of Goan history.
The two Goas. Okay, break that down for us.
The experience of colonization was not monolithic. It was sharply divided by geography and, crucially, by time. The conquest of Goa did not happen all at once.
It happened in phases.
2 entirely distinct phases separated by centuries. First, you have what are known as the Old Conquests.
The Velhas Conquistas. Let's map this out for the listener. What specific areas are we talking about, and why are they so significant?
The Old Conquests include the island of Tiswati, which is where the capital city was established, along with the immediately adjacent districts of Bardez and Salcete.
Okay, so this is the core coastal area.
Right. These areas were captured right at the beginning, in the early 1500s, and the demographic statistics here are vital.
What did the numbers look like?
These 3 districts comprised only about 20% of Goa's total landmass. But, because they were coastal, possessed the best agricultural land and sat astride the major river trade routes.
They were packed.
Incredibly densely populated. That 20% of the land housed roughly 62% of the entire Goan population.
Wow. So they capture this incredibly dense, fertile coastal strip. And what happens to the people living in that pressure cooker?
They bore the absolute horrific brunt of early Portuguese religious extremism.
Which was brutal.
It was. The first few years under Albuquerque were actually relatively pragmatic, but that changed drastically. By 1521, King John III took the throne in Portugal.
And he had a very different approach.
His administration adopted a rigid, uncompromising doctrine, cujus regio ilias religio, The religion of the king is the religion of the people.
There is no room for interpretation there. It is a mandate for absolute forced conversion.
It was an era of brutal persecution, driven largely by the establishment of the Goa Inquisition. It was not a matter of missionaries gently persuading people to attend a new church.
No, it was systemic coercion.
Exactly. If you resisted conversion, the state weaponized the law against you. Your ancestral property was confiscated. You were formally evicted from your lands.
Which naturally triggers mass exoduses.
Thousands of Hindu families were forced to flee their ancient homelands in the old conquests. They desperately carried their sacred idols and deities into the uncolonized hinterlands just to protect them from destruction.
It's a traumatic displacement of an entire demographic. But what about the people who couldn't leave? The ones who stayed and submitted to conversion?
For those who converted, the Portuguese state went to extraordinary, almost obsessive lengths to sever their ties to their native Indian culture.
Because they didn't trust the conversions.
Right. The Inquisition recognized that forcing someone to be baptized didn't necessarily change what was in their heart. So they sought to change their daily reality.
They tried to fundamentally alter their identity. The mechanics of how they did this are just chilling.
It's essentially state-sponsored identity laundering.
How did they attempt to erase someone's heritage on a practical level?
They attacked it from every conceivable angle, starting with their names.
Their actual names.
Yeah, the Portuguese administrators and clergy claimed they couldn't pronounce the native Konkani names because they contained too many heavy consonants unfamiliar to the European tongue.
So what did they do?
They systematically altered them in the official registries. They would insert random vowels to soften the names and make them sound more Portuguese.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if a family's ancestral name was Vithal Sadeshi Via Shenvi Suktankar, the official state records would arbitrarily change it to Vitola Sadisivas Sinai Sungtankar.
Wow. It's a literal erasure of your lineage. You look at a government document or eventually a gravestone, and you don't even recognize your own grandfather's name.
And they didn't stop at names. They went after the most intimate aspects of daily life.
Like food.
They completely weaponized food. The Portuguese understood that the complex Hindu caste system and social hierarchy were deeply tied to dietary purity and specific food taboos.
Okay, so how do they break that?
To ensure that the new Catholic converts could not secretly maintain their former social ties with the remaining Hindus, the Inquisition forced the converts to consume pork and beef.
Which were absolute religious taboos for native Hindus.
Exactly. That is psychological warfare via the dinner table.
It really is.
They even dictated the methods of food preparation. They forced Goan Catholics to add salt to their rice while it was boiling, a practice that was entirely contrary to the local Hindu custom.
Just to make them different.
The ultimate goal of all these micro-regulations was to make the Goan Catholic culturally and socially untouchable to the Goan Hindu.
They wanted to wedge a permanent, unbridgeable chasm between the two communities.
Right, so they could never unite against the colonial power.
You engineer an artificial cultural divide to maintain control. But here's the most fascinating part of this dark era, and really a testament to the sheer resilience of the Goan people.
It didn't entirely work.
No. You can mandate a name change, you can force someone to eat different food under threat of imprisonment, but you cannot easily eradicate centuries of deeply held cultural instinct.
You really cannot. Despite the intense scrutiny of the Inquisition, despite the threat of the stake, the newly minted Goan Catholics retained incredibly deep Indian roots.
Instead of a complete cultural erasure, what emerged was this unique, highly syncretic culture where Catholic theology blended with ancient Hindu practices.
And the examples of this clandestine survival are amazing. You have situations where, well into the 20th century, right under the noses of the European clergy, local traditions persisted.
Like the pre-wedding rituals.
Yes, on the eve of a deeply traditional Catholic wedding, the bride would still undergo the haldi or rose ceremony.
The traditional Indian ritual bath using turmeric, rice flour, and coconut milk to purify and bless the bride.
Exactly. It is such a beautiful image of defiance. They might be reciting Latin vows in a massive stone church the next morning, but the night before, they are practicing the exact same turmeric ritual their ancestors did 1,000 years ago.
I love that.
The research also points out the enduring belief in Satvirati, the sixth night after a child's birth.
What happens on the sixth night?
In local Hindu tradition, this is the night the goddess of destiny visits the child and writes their fate upon their forehead.
And this survived conversion.
It survived intact, right alongside Catholic doctrines of free will and divine providence. It's a profound sociological phenomenon.
It proves that when an imperial power tries to violently suppress a culture, that culture rarely just evaporates. It goes underground. It adapts.
It disguises itself and endures.
So that is the intense, traumatic reality of the coastal 20%, the old conquest. But you mentioned the two Goas. What is the other half of this equation?
The other half is the new conquests, the Novas Conquistas.
And when did they take this?
Over 250 years after Albuquerque captured the coast. Towards the end of the 18th century, the Portuguese finally expanded their control to acquire the rest of Goa's interior hinterlands.
This is the remaining 80% of the landmass, but it's vastly different demographically.
Very different. The new conquests were heavily forested, less developed, and only held about 27% of the overall population.
Okay.
And crucially, by the time the Portuguese acquired these lands in the late 1700s, the fanatical zeal of the early Inquisition had largely burned itself out.
The geopolitical priorities had shifted in Europe. The Enlightenment was beginning to take hold, and the state was less interested in funding massive religious persecution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, the Portuguese administration did not push the aggressive proselytization policies in these new territories. They largely left the local customs alone.
Consequently, the new conquests remained predominantly, overwhelmingly Hindu.
Yes. Remember those massive exoduses we talked about during the early Inquisition?
Yeah, the families fleeing with their deities.
This is where many of those ancient Hindu temples had been secretly relocated and rebuilt.
So you end up with a map of Goa that looks like a cultural bullseye.
Right.
In the center, you have a densely populated coastal, heavily Catholic core that has been deeply influenced by centuries of European contact and trauma.
And surrounding that core is a vast, less populated, heavily forested, and predominantly Hindu hinterland that has largely retained its pre-colonial identity.
Now, if a colonial power is putting this much effort into social engineering, maintaining massive standing armies, and administering this complex territory, the logical assumption is that they are extracting a fortune in wealth.
You would think so.
Because the whole point of an empire is to enrich the motherland. So how much money was Portugal pulling out of Goa?
This is where the story defies all economic logic. Far from being a thriving, profitable imperial hub, Goa was an economic black hole for Portugal.
Wait, really? It suffered from centuries of severe neglect.
Systemic neglect, yeah.
But how is that possible? They controlled the spice trade.
They controlled it initially, but the spice boom was relatively short-lived. By the 17th century, the Dutch and the British had arrived in the Indian Ocean.
And they were better equipped.
Much better. Better ships, better financing, and more ruthless trading companies. They systematically dismantled Portugal's maritime monopoly.
Oh, wow.
Once Portugal lost control of the broader Asian trade networks, they basically just sat on Goa. They didn't harness its natural resources. They didn't invest in a robust local agricultural or manufacturing economy.
So what did the locals do for work? If there is no trade and no industry, how do you survive?
You leave. The economic reality created what historians call a money order economy. And the statistics surrounding this are absolutely staggering and deeply tragic.
Give us the numbers.
Out of a total Goan population of barely 500,000 people, over 3.21 lakh, that's more than 320,000 Goans, were forced to migrate.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Over 60% of the population had to abandon their homeland just to find a way to feed their families.
Yes. The territory offered practically no higher educational facilities. There was one medical school and a secondary school, but beyond that, nothing.
And no jobs.
Absolutely no jobs. So the brightest, most ambitious, and most capable Goans had to pack their bags. They migrated to British Bombay. They traveled across the Indian Ocean to work in British East Africa.
The Middle East too, right?
Yeah. They went to the Middle East. They took jobs as musicians, clerks, and sailors on ships crisscrossing the globe.
It's a massive brain drain and labor drain. And the families that stayed behind in Goa.
They survived almost entirely on remittances. The money orders sent back home every month by those migrant workers were the only thing keeping the local Goan economy afloat.
That makes absolutely no economic sense from an imperial perspective.
Not at all.
If Portugal is not extracting wealth and the local population is fleeing just to survive, why hold on to the territory? The research notes that maintaining the civil and military administration in Goa was actually costing the Portuguese treasury around 7 million escudos a year.
They were bleeding money.
Hand over fist. To keep a colony that had no strategic or economic value left, why not just let it go?
Because you are trying to apply a modern, rational economic framework to an empire that was operating on pure, unadulterated emotion and historical romanticism.
Emotion over economics.
Exactly. To the regime in Lisbon, Goa was not a line item on a balance sheet. It was a padrón glorioso, a glorious memorial.
A padrón. For those who might not know, a padrón is one of those massive stone pillars topped with a cross and the Portuguese coat of arms, right?
That's right. The early explorers, like Vasco da Gama, would physically plant them on a newly discovered beach to claim the land for the king.
So Goa itself became a giant metaphorical padrón.
It was the physical manifestation of their age of discoveries. And you have to look at the psychology of Portugal by the 20th century.
They weren't exactly a superpower anymore.
Not at all. Their global empire, which once spanned the earth, was a shadow of its former self. They had suffered humiliating territorial losses to the British in Africa during the late 19th century.
So the nation was nursing a deep collective inferiority complex.
They felt like a forgotten power on the edge of Europe. And in that psychological state, Goa became a sacred relic. It was the surviving soul of their former greatness.
To surrender Goa, even if it was bleeding them dry financially, would be to publicly admit that the Portuguese era of global supremacy was definitively permanently dead.
It became, as the future dictator would frame it, an absolute point of honor.
So the Goan people are essentially held hostage, forced to live in a stagnant, impoverished economy, entirely to serve as a prop for Portugal's wounded national pride.
Sadly, yes.
Which brings us to the tipping point. How long can a territory survive on pride and remittances? We enter the 20th century and the world is modernizing, but Goa is trapped in this weird colonial amber.
And at the center of the conflict that is about to erupt is a man named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar.
Who is he, and how does he alter the equation?
Salazar is the architect of the final, darkest chapter of Portuguese rule in Goa. In 1928, the Portuguese Republic is experiencing a catastrophic financial crisis.
The government is unstable, inflation is rampant.
Right, so in desperation, the military leadership brings in Salazar, who was an austere, highly conservative economics professor at the University of Coimbra, to fix the nation's finances.
An academic given the keys to the treasury.
And he actually succeeds in stabilizing the economy. He balances the budget. But in doing so, he consolidates an immense amount of political power.
Which is never a good sign.
By 1932, he has essentially dismantled the Democratic Republic and assumed the powers of an absolute, unquestioned dictator.
He establishes a regime he calls the Estado Novo, the new state.
It is a fascist-leaning, deeply authoritarian, corporatist government.
And what does an austere, fascist-leaning dictator sitting in Lisbon mean for the people living in Goa?
It is an absolute disaster, because Salazar's vision for the empire requires strict hierarchy and absolute control.
Right.
In 1930, he implements a piece of legislation called the Acto Colonial, the Colonial Act.
Let's unpack the legal ramifications of this, because this act changes everything.
It really does.
Yeah.
Under the previous Portuguese Republic, which had its flaws but was generally liberal, Goans were legally considered full, equal citizens of Portugal.
They had voting rights, they had representation in the parliament in Lisbon, they had civil liberties.
The Acto Colonial takes a sledgehammer to all of that. It legally and explicitly downgrades the status of Goans.
Downgrades them how?
They go from being equal citizens of the Republic to being legally defined as mere colonial subjects.
That is a staggering psychological and legal blow. To wake up one morning and find out your government has officially declared you a second-class human being based purely on race and geography?
It was a brutal demotion. And it wasn't just on paper. The Salazar regime actively began a policy of renationalizing the administration in Goa.
Meaning what, exactly?
They systematically fired or demoted native Goan civil servants, judges, and administrators, and replaced them with white Portuguese nationals sent over from Europe.
They wanted the face of authority to be strictly white and European.
Exactly. It transitions from a neglected, stagnant colony into a full-blown, terrifying police state.
If you want to understand how deep the paranoia of this regime went, you have to look at the PIDE, the Portuguese secret police.
Oh, the PIDE were terrifying.
This wasn't just some vague surveillance program listening to politicians. This was an entity that inserted itself into the most intimate, mundane details of daily life.
The level of control was suffocating. Civil liberties were entirely suspended. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, and absolutely no freedom of assembly.
We mentioned the wedding invitations earlier. Think about the logistics of that kind of censorship.
Falero's research details how every single printed word in the entire territory had to be scrutinized by a government official.
You want to print a newspaper article. Censored. You want to print a poem? Censored.
Even private religious events. You want to print an invitation for your son's thread ceremony? You have to submit the draft to the PIDE, wait for them to read it, and it must carry the physical ink stamp. Visado pela censura.
Approved by the censors. It was a system designed to crush any independent thought before it could even be articulated.
If you wanted to hold a birthday party in your own home with more than a handful of guests, you needed to apply for a permit from the police.
And they might send an agent to stand in the corner of your living room to make sure no one discussed politics.
And the enforcement of these rules was vicious.
The history brings up a man named Casimiro Montero. Who was he?
Montero was an enforcer for the PIDE, and he became the most feared man in Goa. He was a ruthless agent specifically tasked with hunting down political dissidents.
And his methods?
The methods used in the police cells under his command were barbaric, severe beatings, psychological torture, indefinite detention without trial. He was the blunt instrument of Salazar's paranoia.
So you have a population that has been economically starved, legally stripped of their citizenship, and subjected to a terrifying secret police.
Yeah, it's bleak.
How do you even begin to organize a resistance when you can't legally gather 3 people in a room or mail a letter without it being read?
It requires individuals of immense courage and intellectual foresight. And this is where we see the rise of Tristão de Bragança Cunha, who is universally recognized today as the father of Goan nationalism.
Tell us about T.B. Cunha. He doesn't sound like a typical grassroots rebel.
He wasn't. Cunha was a highly educated, Paris-trained engineer. He came from the Goan Catholic elite.
So he had resources.
He did. He had seen the world. He understood global political currents. And he recognized that isolated, localized complaining in Goa was never going to defeat Salazar.
So what does he do?
In 1928, he founded the Goa National Congress. His crucial insight was that the Goan struggle for freedom could not exist in a vacuum. It had to be intimately aligned with a much larger, massive Indian independence movement that was gathering momentum next door under Mahatma Gandhi.
He provides the intellectual framework. He starts writing pamphlets, smuggling information out, trying to build a cohesive narrative of resistance.
And the people who followed in his footsteps paid a terrifying price.
There is one specific story in the research that completely stopped me in my tracks. It perfectly encapsulates the quiet, unbreakable resolve of these activists. It's the story of Dr. Pundelik Gaitande.
A prominent Goan surgeon and a very dedicated freedom fighter.
Exactly. Dr. Gaitande is highly educated, deeply nationalist. He marries a Portuguese woman, Adela, who is from the Azores.
Right.
Because of his relentless political activities and his refusal to bow to the regime, the PIT eventually arrests him.
And they don't just keep him in Goa.
No. They deport him. They ship him all the way back to Portugal and throw him into the Peniche Fort jail.
Which was a notorious, grim 16th century fortress built on a rocky peninsula jutting into the Atlantic Ocean. It was Salazar's primary dungeon for high-value political prisoners.
It was a bleak, miserable place. And Adela, his Portuguese wife, refuses to abandon him. She demands to go with him.
So they essentially spend their honeymoon inside a freezing fascist prison cell.
Right. And the detail that gets me is this. A French journalist somehow manages to get access to the prison to interview T.B. Cunha, who is also in prison there.
Okay.
The journalist sees Dr. Gaitande and his wife, is completely bewildered by the situation, and asks him, "What made you choose this place for your honeymoon?"
And Dr. Gaitande's response is amazing.
Sitting in a political dungeon, he just calmly replies, "Homage to sacrifice."
Homage to sacrifice.
Yeah.
It is a stunning phrase. It reveals a level of moral clarity and commitment that the Salazar regime simply could not comprehend, let alone break.
It shows that the regime's brutality was actually hardening the resolve of the resistance.
It was. And there is a profound, almost poetic irony regarding Salazar's racist Acto Colonial.
Oh, how so?
Salazar intended the act to permanently subjugate the local population and reassert white European dominance.
Mm-hmm.
But if we analyze the sociological impact, it achieved the exact, spectacular opposite of its intended goal.
How did downgrading their citizenship backfire?
Well, before 1930, you had a Goan society that was still somewhat fractured. The Portuguese had spent centuries, as we discussed, trying to drive a wedge between the Goan Catholics and the Goan Hindus.
And to some extent, among the upper classes, it had worked.
It had. You had a Goan Catholic elite that, while perhaps unhappy with the economy, still felt a deep cultural and religious affinity with Lisbon.
They spoke Portuguese, they read Portuguese literature.
They felt they were part of the broader Lusitanian world. They felt they had a seat at the table, even if it was at the far end.
Right, they were still part of the club.
Precisely. But the sheer, blunt racial discrimination of the Acto Colonial kicked them away from the table entirely. It alienated everyone simultaneously.
It ironically united both Goan Hindus and Goan Catholics in a shared sense of profound outrage.
Because suddenly it didn't matter if you went to Mass and spoke perfect European Portuguese. The regime looked at the color of your skin and told you that you were a lesser human being.
That shared humiliation erased the divisions the Portuguese had spent 4 centuries building.
Elite Catholics, who might have otherwise remained loyal or neutral, were radicalized. They realized their future lay not with a fading European dictatorship, but with their fellow Goans.
Many of them became the fiercest, most articulate leaders of the freedom movement.
So Salazar, in his arrogance, actually forged the very unified resistance that would eventually dismantle his empire.
He compressed the spring as tight as it would go, and that spring, finally, violently snapped on June 18th, 1946.
A hugely important date.
Let's move into this pivotal moment. I want to set the scene. We are in the town of Margao. It is the middle of June, so the monsoon heat is heavy and oppressive.
And civil liberties have been dead for over 15 years.
The ban on public assembly is absolute. The PID agents are everywhere, watching every corner. The silence of this police state is a physical weight on the town.
The fear is total. No one dares speak out. And into this heavily pressurized silence steps a man who is entirely immune to Portuguese intimidation, Ram Manohar Lohia.
Lohia is a fascinating catalyst in this story. He isn't Goan.
No, he's a firebrand Indian nationalist, a brilliant socialist thinker, and a very close associate of Mahatma Gandhi.
He has just spent years suffering in a brutal Lahore jail for defying the British Empire. His health is ruined.
He comes down to Goa simply to rest and recuperate, staying with his university friend, the Goan nationalist, Dr. Julian de Menezes.
But Lohia is a man of action. He is not the kind of person who can sit quietly on a veranda sipping tea while the people around him are living in terror.
He looks at the suffocating atmosphere in Goa, he listens to the stories of the PID, and he makes a decision.
He decides that the aura of fear has to be shattered. The ban on public assembly must be defied, not in secret, but openly in the light of day.
So, on the afternoon of June 18, 1946, Lohia and Dr. Menezes do something unthinkable. They walk right out into the heart of Margao.
Word had quietly spread through the underground networks that something was going to happen, so a massive, anxious crowd has gathered in the square.
The Portuguese police are there in force, armed, tense, ready to crack skulls.
The atmosphere must have been electric. And Lohia doesn't pull a weapon. He doesn't throw a bomb.
No.
He simply stands up in the middle of the square, raises his voice, and begins to address the masses.
It is a profoundly cinematic turning point. Just the physical act of a man standing up and speaking his mind in public, in direct defiance of a fascist decree, shatters the psychological hold of the regime.
He didn't have to fire a single shot to inflict massive damage. He just spoke truth to power.
Of course, the police immediately swarm him. A local colonial administrator actually pulls a revolver and points it at Lohia.
But Lohia calmly bats the gun away and continues speaking until they physically drag him off to the police station.
The regime arrests him and quickly deports him back across the border, hoping to silence the event.
But the damage to their aura of invincibility is permanently done.
That single, courageous act of defiance proves to the Goan people that the regime can be challenged. It is the spark that reignites the dormant freedom movement.
It breaks the spell of the dictatorship. But here is what I find really interesting about the aftermath of June 18th.
What's that?
We often like to imagine history as this neat, unified march toward justice. The spark is lit, the people unite into one giant, harmonious army, and they march to victory.
But that is not what happens here at all.
The spark actually causes a massive fracture within the resistance itself.
Yes, a massive proliferation of ideologies. The research notes that in the wake of Lohia's defiance, over 15 different nationalist organizations spring up almost overnight.
Because once the seal of silence is broken, everyone wants to take action.
But they vehemently disagree on how to take action.
How does the movement split? What are the dividing lines?
It primarily splits along tactical and philosophical lines. On one side, you have the traditional National Congress Goa leadership. These are largely the Gandhians.
They firmly believe that the struggle must remain strictly nonviolent.
Right. They advocate for satyagraha, peaceful civil disobedience, marching with Indian flags, deliberately breaking minor laws.
And peacefully courting mass arrest to overwhelm the prison system and draw international sympathy. They want to win the moral high ground.
But on the other side of the fracture, You have what the history refers to as the Young Turks, the militants.
And their approach was, well, it was very different.
Very different. These were younger, hot-blooded activists who looked at the reality of Salazar's fascist police state and came to a very grim conclusion.
They argued that peaceful protests and courting arrest might work against the British, who possessed a modicum of democratic accountability back in London.
But they argued it was suicidal against a fascist regime that relished torture and had absolutely no respect for human rights or international opinion.
They realized you can't shame a shameless dictator.
Exactly. They believed that violence had to be met with violence.
Yeah.
They believed the only language the Portuguese understood was force.
So this leads to the formation of radical underground groups, the most prominent being the Azad Gamantak Dal, led by figures like Vishwanath Lawand.
These guys were not sitting in the town square singing hymns. They were taking to the jungles.
They initiated a full-blown guerrilla war.
The Azad Gamantak Dal began conducting coordinated armed raids on Portuguese police outposts to steal weapons.
They actively sabotaged infrastructure, blew up bridges, and attacked the economic assets of the regime.
Specifically targeting the mines and businesses that were collaborating with the colonial authorities.
So you have this incredibly complex, chaotic situation on the ground. You have peaceful marchers getting beaten by the police in the cities and armed guerrillas fighting gun battles in the dense forests.
It's a very volatile mix.
But while all this internal chaos is unfolding inside Goa, what is happening next door? Because in 1947, the geopolitical map of the world changes forever.
India wins its independence.
The British leave. Suddenly, Goa is no longer bordered by another colonial power. It is bordered by a massive, newly independent, highly mobilized democratic republic.
Which completely shifts the dynamic.
Let's move into the 1950s and look at the diplomatic chess game. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru is now leading India.
He is standing tall on the world stage, seeing himself as a champion of the global anti-colonial movement.
How does he approach the problem of Goa?
Initially, Nehru approaches it with extreme logical optimism. He assumes that the sheer momentum of history will solve the problem.
He looks at the situation and thinks, the mighty British Empire has recognized the reality and left.
Right. The French are actively negotiating a peaceful handover of their small Indian territories like Pondicherry. The Portuguese will obviously see the writing on the wall, realize their position is untenable, and agree to a graceful diplomatic exit.
He expects them to act like rational statesmen.
He does. But as we discussed, Salazar is not operating on logic. He is operating on imperial fantasy.
When the Indian government politely requests negotiations for the handover of Goa, Salazar vehemently, aggressively refuses.
He refuses to even entertain the premise that Goa is a colony.
He claims it's literally an overseas province of Portugal itself, just separated by an ocean.
Yes. To him, handing over Goa would be like France handing over Paris.
The diplomatic rhetoric between New Delhi and Lisbon gets incredibly heated, and there is a fascinating behind-the-scenes anecdote in the book about the specific language the Indians were using.
It really highlights the importance of international messaging. The Indian political leadership, out of sheer frustration, kept referring to Goa in their speeches as a pimple on the face of India.
It's a very visceral, insulting metaphor. You are an unsightly blemish on our beautiful new nation.
But it wasn't playing well on the international stage, was it?
No, it wasn't. And this is where Rajni Patel, a highly influential barrister and behind-the-scenes political advisor, intervenes.
He pulls Defense Minister Krishna Menon aside and advises a change in tactics.
He tells him, stop calling it a pimple. You are trying to win over international opinion in English, specifically the British and the Americans. Use a more sophisticated word, call it an anachronism.
An anachronism, something that is fundamentally out of touch and out of place in the current era.
It's a brilliant linguistic shift. It frames Portugal not just as a nuisance, but as a backward, obsolete dinosaur that refuses to accept the modern world order.
It was a much more effective way to isolate Portugal from its NATO allies, but regardless of the vocabulary, Salazar refuses to budge.
And his stubbornness is rooted in a specific terrifying delusion known as the domino theory.
Explain his fear here. Why was tiny Goa so vital to the survival of the rest of the empire?
Salazar looked at his map. Portugal still held massive, highly lucrative colonies in Africa, specifically Angola and Mozambique.
These territories were rich in resources and absolutely vital to the Portuguese economy.
Salazar believed that if he showed even a single ounce of weakness in India, if he gave up tiny, unprofitable Goa without a fight, it would send a catastrophic signal across the globe.
He thought it would be blood in the water.
Exactly. He feared that the nascent independence movements in Angola and Mozambique would see that the Portuguese Empire could be intimidated into retreating.
He believed Goa was the linchpin of imperial prestige. If Goa fell, Africa would fall. Therefore, Goa had to be defended at all costs, simply as a deterrent.
He is sacrificing the Goan people to intimidate his African subjects. It's incredibly cynical.
Very much so.
And because Salazar absolutely refuses to even discuss a plebiscite, he flat out rejects the idea of letting the Goan people vote on their own future. Nehru realizes diplomacy is a dead end.
But Nehru is still deeply committed to his global image as a man of peace. He doesn't want to use the army. So what is his backup plan?
Economic strangulation. The Indian government decides that if Portugal won't talk, India will simply starve the colonial administration out.
In the mid-1950s, New Delhi imposes a comprehensive, massive economic blockade on Goa.
The logic seems sound on paper. You just cut off the oxygen. How did they implement it?
They sealed the borders completely. They cut off all road transport, halted all train services, and banned shipping from Indian ports to Goa.
But the most devastating move was financial.
Yes, they froze all Goan bank accounts held in Indian banks. They stopped the mail services. They completely suspended all postal money transfers.
And remember, we spent a lot of time earlier discussing how Goa was entirely a money order economy.
The entire society was surviving on the remittances sent back by Goan migrants working in places like Bombay.
Exactly. The Indian strategists knew this. Their goal was to inflict such severe, immediate economic pain that the local population, desperate and unable to feed themselves, would spontaneously rise up in a massive revolt and overthrow the Portuguese administration from the inside.
This would achieve liberation without India having to fire a single shot.
It sounds like a foolproof, bloodless strategy. Squeeze the economy, wait for the collapse.
But this is where the history takes a turn that is so wild, so completely contrary to expectations, that it sounds like a geopolitical comedy of errors.
The blockade doesn't just fail. It doesn't just result in a stalemate. It achieves the exact spectacular opposite of what Nehru intended.
It is perhaps the most surprising revelation in Falero's entire book. The Indian economic blockade accidentally triggered an unprecedented economic golden age for Portuguese Goa.
How is that even mathematically possible? You seal the borders of an impoverished territory, and they suddenly get rich. Explain the mechanics of this miracle.
The answer was buried right under their feet. Mineral ore, specifically massive, previously unexploited deposits of iron ore and manganese located in those exact same new Conquest hinterlands we discussed earlier.
Okay, but you can't eat iron ore. You need a buyer.
And geopolitics provided the perfect, desperate buyers. It is the 1950s. The post-World War II global economy is in overdrive. Nations like Japan and West Germany are desperately trying to rebuild their shattered infrastructure and industries.
And they have an insatiable hunger for raw materials, particularly iron and manganese for steel production.
And India just locked the doors to Goa, forcing the Portuguese to panic.
Panic bred innovation. The Portuguese Colonial administration, suddenly terrified of an economic collapse and a native uprising, woke up from centuries of administrative slumber.
They actively encouraged compliant local Goan mine owners to drastically ramp up extraction.
And because they couldn't ship anything through India, they bypassed the subcontinent entirely.
They started loading massive bulk carriers in the Mormugao harbor and shipping millions of tons of ore directly across the ocean to Japan, West Germany, and the United States.
The pivot is incredible, and the revenues didn't just trickle in, they exploded.
The statistics are mind-boggling. The research points out that export revenues jumped from something like 12 million rupees to 30 million rupees practically overnight.
Mining, which had been a marginal activity, suddenly accounted for 96% of Goa's total export economy. The territory was absolutely flooded with hard foreign currency.
And this massive influx of wealth completely transformed the physical and social landscape of Goa.
Because the Portuguese had to bypass the Indian blockade, they finally, after 4 centuries of absolute neglect, started pouring money into heavy infrastructure.
They couldn't use Indian roads, so they paved their own. They couldn't use Indian airports, so they built their own modern airfields in Goa, Daman, and Diu to maintain vital air links with the outside world.
They are forced to modernize. But the craziest part of this boom is the contrast it created with the rest of India.
You have to remember, newly independent India in the 1950s is pursuing strict, socialist, import substitution economic policies. It is an era of severe austerity. Foreign goods are banned or heavily taxed.
But in Goa, because those massive ore ships sailing back from Europe and Japan couldn't return empty, they needed ballast. So they brought back consumer goods, luxury goods.
Goa was suddenly inundated with the finest products the global market had to offer.
High-end imported wines from Europe, Swiss chocolates, expensive foreign textiles, perfumes, the latest electronics, and radios from Japan.
And because the mining industry was booming, high-wage jobs appeared out of nowhere to support the logistics, the trucking, the ports. The Goan people suddenly had the disposable income to buy these luxuries.
So Nehru's grand, nonviolent strategy to starve the Portuguese out actually funded the enemy, modernized their infrastructure, and gave the Goan populace a taste of cosmopolitan luxury they had never seen in their entire history.
It is a colossal miscalculation.
How does New Delhi react when they realize their blockade has essentially turned Goa into the Monaco of the Indian subcontinent?
With immense mounting frustration. The blockade was a humiliating failure. It not only failed to dislodge the Portuguese, it made the colonial regime richer, better armed, and more deeply entrenched.
By 1960, the pressure on Nehru is reaching a boiling point. The internal Goan freedom fighters, both the Gandhians and the guerrillas, are exhausted and demanding decisive action.
Furthermore, the international community is watching. Newly independent African nations who looked to India as the moral leader of the decolonization movement were starting to ask very uncomfortable questions.
They were saying, you preach to the world about ending empires, yet you tolerate a fascist European dictatorship occupying a piece of your own coastline. Why?
The hypocrisy was becoming politically unsustainable, which pushes us to the final breaking point.
December 1961. Diplomacy is dead. The blockade is a joke. And Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, the man born in the exact town where Vasco da Gama first landed, finally forces the Prime Minister's hand.
Menon essentially orchestrates a military mobilization and presents Nehru with a fait accompli. He moves the troops to the border and says, "The world is watching. We cannot back down. We are going in."
This initiates Operation Vijay.
Let's look at the tactical board. Militarily, this was never going to be a fair fight, was it?
Not at all. The Indian Armed Forces, commanded by Major General K.P. Candith, massed over 30,000 highly trained, battle-hardened troops at the borders, supported by modern armor, jet fighters, and a naval blockade.
Facing them was a Portuguese garrison of roughly 3,300 men. And these were not elite shock troops.
Many were young conscripts sent over from Portugal, poorly equipped, suffering from low morale, and completely lacking the heavy artillery or air support needed to repel a massive invasion.
Militarily, the outcome was predetermined.
But the real danger in this moment wasn't that the Indian army would lose a protracted war. The real terrifying danger was emanating from Lisbon.
When Salazar realizes that the Indian invasion is finally actually imminent, he doesn't order a tactical retreat.
He sends a chilling, utterly insane directive to his governor-general in Goa, Manuel Antonio Vassallo y Silva.
What exactly did the dictator order his general to do?
Salazar orders a comprehensive scorched earth policy. He sends a telegraph commanding that before the Indian forces can capture the territory, the Portuguese military must systematically destroy Goa.
He ordered them to dynamite the infrastructure, the bridges, the ports, the newly built airports.
Worse, he ordered them to destroy the major towns and the centuries-old heritage buildings, including the magnificent ancient churches of Old Goa that held the relics of St. Francis Xavier.
Burn the history to the ground, so the Indians inherit nothing but ashes.
Yes. And furthermore, he explicitly orders his outnumbered, outgunned troops to fight to the last man. He strictly forbids surrender under any circumstances.
It is a demand for a mass suicide. He wants a bloodbath. Yeah. He wants the Indian army to be forced to massacre over 3,000 young Portuguese soldiers in the flaming ruins of ancient Catholic churches.
Why? What possible strategic value does a massacre serve?
It was entirely a PR gambit, a desperate, cynical ploy by a fading dictator. Salazar knew he couldn't hold Goa militarily.
But if he could manufacture a horrific Holocaust, he could take photographs of the slaughtered Portuguese boys and the ruined churches, march into the United Nations in New York, point at India, the nation of Gandhi, the global champion of peace and nonviolence, and scream, "Look at these monsters! Look at the barbaric atrocities they committed against a peaceful Christian province."
He was willing to sacrifice every single one of his men and 4.5 centuries of architectural heritage just to win a propaganda victory and shame India on the global stage.
It is pure sociopathic megalomania. But before we get to the invasion and how the Governor General reacted to that horrific order, there is an anecdote in the research that I absolutely love.
Because history isn't just troop movements and dictators. It's also bizarre, deeply human moments.
Just days before the guns start firing, when the tension is at its absolute peak, Falero shares the surreal story of the King of Bitolum.
It is a moment of profound absurdity right on the edge of the abyss.
So the invasion is imminent. Everyone knows it. 4 young Portuguese military officers are patrolling the hinterlands of the Bicolum district. They stray off the main roads and stumble upon this surprisingly beautiful, sprawling estate in the forest.
The estate belongs to a wealthy, local Goan feudal lord, a Sardasai. When the heavily armed Portuguese officers approach, he comes out to meet them and, with a touch of grandiosity, introduces himself as the King of Bicolum.
Now, in a normal war movie, this is where the locals either capture the enemy scouts or run for their lives. But what does the king do? He invites them inside.
And he doesn't just offer them a glass of water and point them to the road. He hosts them for an overnight, lavish, Omar Khayyam-style feast. We are talking flowing wine, abundant food, music, dancing.
The Portuguese officers, who are expecting to be shot at any minute by Indian troops, are completely blown away by this hospitality.
They have such a good time that a fortnight later, right as the war is literally about to start, they actually invite the king onto their warship in the harbor for a return lunch.
Falero calls it a dinner suspended by history.
It perfectly captures the deeply strange, intertwined reality of Goan and Portuguese lives. After 450 years, the lines between colonizer and colonized, enemy and friend, had become incredibly blurred on an individual level.
They were sharing a meal while the machinery of war was locking into place around them.
But the reality of that war did arrive. On December 18, 1961, the Indian military crosses the border. The advance is swift, surgical, and overwhelming. The Portuguese defenses crumble rapidly.
But Falero's research highlights 2 specific moments of Portuguese resistance that are just overflowing with historical irony. It feels like history is writing its own poetry. Let's talk about the land resistance first.
The Portuguese military did attempt to mount a defense. The fiercest, most concerted land resistance against the advancing Indian armor occurred at a specific village where the Portuguese troops dug in and fought hard. That village was Verna.
Why is the location of Verna so significant to our story?
Because Verna is the exact village where Malpai lived.
Are you kidding me? Malpai, the powerful local leader we talked about an hour ago, the man who specifically invited Afonso de Albuquerque and the Portuguese to invade Goa in 1510.
Yes. The exact geographic spot where the invitation was issued 451 years earlier became the site of the bloodiest final resistance to their eviction. The empire died on the exact plot of land where it was born.
That is mind-blowing. But it actually gets even better, because out at sea, there is a naval engagement that mirrors that irony perfectly.
As the Indian troops are advancing on land, the Indian Navy's frigates entered the Mormugao harbor to neutralize the Portuguese naval presence. They engage a Portuguese destroyer.
And this Portuguese ship refuses to surrender. It doesn't strike its colors. The captain orders his men to fight. They engage in a fierce gun duel with the heavier Indian ships.
They keep their cannons blazing, taking massive damage until the guns are literally incapacitated. The ship is burning and they run out of ammunition. It is a stubborn, heroic, and entirely futile last stand.
What is the name of this fighting Portuguese ship?
The Afonso de Albuquerque.
The ship is named after the exact man who conquered Goa in 1510. Think about the visual symmetry of this entire colonial epoch.
The Portuguese arrived on the coast of India in 1498 with Vasco da Gama, cannons blazing from the decks of their wooden sail ships.
And they leave in 1961, driven out by a man from da Gama's landing spot, fighting their final battle on a steel warship named after their conqueror, with its cannons blazing until the bitter end.
It is a perfect, poetic historical loop. You could not script a more fitting conclusion.
The historical echoes are incredibly loud. But while the Afonso de Albuquerque fought to the end, the broader Holocaust that Salazar demanded, the destruction of the cities and the mass suicide of the army did not happen.
And that salvation is entirely thanks to the immense moral courage of one single man, Governor General Vassallo y Silva.
Let's talk about Vassallo y Silva's final hours. He is sitting in his headquarters. He can hear the Indian artillery. He looks out at the overwhelming Indian forces closing in.
He looks down at the telegraph from his dictator, demanding he burn Goa to the ground and sacrifice all 3,000 of his young men to win a PR battle. What goes through his mind, and what choice does he make?
He recognizes the absolute futility and the sheer evil of the order. He is a military man, but he is not a fanatic. He evaluates the situation and calls Salazar's demand for destruction a sacrificio inútil, a useless sacrifice.
He famously writes in his final dispatches, "I cannot destroy the evidence of our greatness in the Orient."
He looks at the magnificent churches, the cathedrals of old Goa, the infrastructure, and he realizes that destroying them doesn't punish India, it just erases history.
Exactly. He knows that disobeying a direct order from a fascist dictator will permanently ruin his career. He knows he will face a court-martial, disgrace, and likely exile when he returns to Portugal. But he chooses humanity over his own safety.
Defying Salazar, Vassallo y Silva formally signs the instrument of surrender.
He surrenders the entire territory within roughly 36 hours of the invasion starting. By putting his signature on that paper, he saves the lives of his 3,300 men who would have been slaughtered.
He saves the lives of countless advancing Indian soldiers and innocent Goan civilians caught in the crossfire. And he saves the spectacular ancient architecture and heritage of Goa from being reduced to ash.
He chose to preserve a civilization rather than appease a tyrant's wounded pride.
Which brings us to the aftermath, the reality of the morning after the empire falls. Because Salazar's reaction to this surrender in Lisbon was incredibly bitter and deeply revealing of his character.
Oh, Salazar was furious. When the news reaches Lisbon that his troops surrendered, that they didn't fight to the last man and die for his glory, he is apoplectic.
And when he finds out that the Indian military is actually treating the Portuguese soldiers relatively well as prisoners of war, adhering to the Geneva Convention, he essentially abandons them.
He did. The Indian government offered to repatriate the POWs quickly, but Salazar initially refused to take them back. He didn't want these traitors returning to Portugal to tell the truth about the overwhelming Indian force and the absurdity of his orders.
He wanted them to rot in Indian camps to suffer for denying him his glorious martyrdom narrative.
It's a tragic, pathetic end for those young soldiers, used as pawns and then discarded by their own country when they refused to die on cue.
But what about Goa itself? The European flag comes down, the Indian tricolor goes up, the territory is officially integrated into the massive, sprawling Democratic Republic of India.
How did a society that had lived under 4.5 centuries of unique colonial history and decades of rigid fascist dictatorship suddenly adapt to the chaos of modern Indian democratic politics?
Well, according to Falero's research, Goan politicians adapted to the mechanisms of Indian democracy very, very quickly, perhaps a little too quickly and enthusiastically.
He highlights a fascinating and somewhat humorous political phenomenon that took root in the territory, known as the Ayaram Gayaram culture.
Explain Ayaram Gayaram for us.
It translates roughly to the culture of political defectors. It describes politicians shamelessly jumping from one political party to another, crossing the aisle whenever it is personally advantageous to secure a cabinet seat or hold on to power.
Opportunism at its finest.
Exactly. And Falero notes that Goa practically led the entire nation in this dark art of political floor crossing. Throughout the late 20th century, the political instability was legendary. In the 1990s alone, Goa saw 13 different chief ministers take office in a single decade.
The local politicians became absolute masters at finding loopholes and circumventing the National Anti-Defection Act.
It's as if, having lived under a rigid, humorless, monolithic dictatorship where you had zero choices for so long, once they finally got their hands on democratic loopholes, they decided to utilize them to the absolute chaotic maximum.
But it wasn't just the politics that changed. The very fabric of the society, the demographics of the land underwent a massive shift post-liberation, didn't they?
A profound shift. The integration opened the borders in both directions. First, because the Portuguese government, even after leaving, continued to offer passports and citizenship to Goans born before 1961 and their descendants, the historic trend of mass emigration did not stop. It actually accelerated.
Many Goans took those passports and left for better economic opportunities in Europe, or they joined the massive labor migrations to the Gulf countries.
So the native brain drain continued.
Yes, and simultaneously, with the borders to the rest of India finally wide open, citizens from all over the massive subcontinent began flocking into Goa. They were drawn by its immense natural beauty, its unexploited resources, and eventually the massive, booming global tourism industry.
The territory was finally connected to the economic engine of 1 billion people.
The result was a rapid demographic dilution, to the point where Falero quotes an observant journalist who noted a profound reality. It wasn't just that Goa was now inside India, the reality was that India was in Goa.
With the influx of migrants from neighboring states, the native Goan, with their unique syncretic culture, increasingly found themselves reduced to a demographic minority in their own ancestral homeland.
It fundamentally and permanently altered the cultural fabric of the state.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 1961 liberation, I want to leave you, the listener, with the thought to mull over.
We are often taught to view history through very clean, simple, black and white lenses. We like our narratives straightforward. There is an evil, plundering colonizer, and there is an innocent, oppressed, colonized people. The colonizer arrives by force, they steal the wealth, and eventually they are driven out, restoring the land to its original purity.
But the history of Goa completely resists that simple, comfortable framing.
Completely. Look at the incredibly jagged, murky history we've uncovered today. This is a territory that was originally conquered not by a blind invasion, but because a local leader essentially handed a foreign armada an invitation to settle a local grudge.
It is a place where centuries of brutal religious persecution and forced assimilation didn't erase the native identity,
Yeah.
but somehow birthed a deeply inseparable, resilient, and beautiful blend of Eastern tradition and Western theology that exists nowhere else on Earth.
And it is a place where, in the final terrifying hours of a 463-year empire, a fascist dictator's cruel order to destroy an entire civilization was ignored by his own colonial general, who chose to sacrifice his own career and freedom to save the land he had ruled.
So when you look at that complex tapestry, when you see how deeply the lives, the blood, and the culture of the East and the West became intertwined over half a millennium, you have to ask yourself a profound question.
When an empire finally falls, the flags are lowered, and the dust of history settles, what truly belongs to the conqueror and what has forever indelibly been claimed by the conquered.